Let's do this. Always something. Right. Let's do this. Here we go.
The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brooks Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brooks Show on this Friday night, or at least here on the East Coast, it's Friday night. I'm excited about today's show. I've got a special guest. This is going to be a lot of fun, and hopefully you guys are excited too. Just before we get to that, quick reminders, right? Don't forget to use the like feature. If you want to ask questions, you can do that using the super chat feature on YouTube. Please keep the questions on topic. I'm not going to take questions on off topic all over the place. So let's stick to the topic, and questions for me or for Kira, both of us, that'll be great. We have today a friend. I've known Kira for a long time, Kira Peikoff. Kira is an editor-in-chief in Leaps magazine, which is an award-winning digital magazine that covers scientific innovation, ethics, and the future of humanity. Previously, she contributed articles to the New York Times Science section, Newsweek, Popular Mechanics, Slate, Cosmo, and other outlets. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from New York University and a master's in bioethics from Columbia University. She's also a novelist with 4 novels. Is that right? Yep. So welcome, Kira. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me. So I want to talk a little bit about a background, and then I want to jump into kind of the science, and in particular to the whole COVID and what's going on. So tell us a little bit about why journalism, how you got into going to study journalism, and then about how your career as a novelist.
Sure, I'll try to keep that really short. Just for background, so I grew up as a kid always loving reading and stories and storytelling, and that was always my inclination. I would always come home from school and write stories, and with my dad, actually, our favorite pastime together was coming up with stories where he and I would take turns writing the plot out loud, and that was our most favorite activity. So from a young age, I was pretty much predisposed to narrative storytelling and was figuring out what I wanted to major in college. English did not work for me at NYU. It was basically an experience that I would only recommend if you want to destroy your love of literature. So I quickly dropped out of English, which I thought was going to be my major, and I switched to journalism, which was a total breath of fresh air, to use a cliche, if I will. And it was very reality oriented. It was all about gathering the facts, getting to the truth, and reporting on objective reality, and telling important stories along the way that would raise awareness of important perspectives and issues. So I really gravitated towards that. I loved my journalism program and all my professors. And then at the same time, I pursued novel writing just as my passion to tell fictional stories on the side, and in between lots of other jobs, wrote the books that I have out.
So Deborah wants to know, she says she loves your books, and she wants to know, when is the next one coming out?
Well, you and my agent both are getting on my back. I actually have an idea for my next book, which I'm excited about, my editor and my agent all love, but this COVID pandemic has really derailed me, and I have no space, mental or logistical space, to work on a book right now, and that's just my reality. Until things get back to normal to some degree, I just won't be able to work on it.
So all your novels have a science, a feature science in one way or another, right? How did that come about? Was that purposeful from the beginning, or in a sense, an accident?
So I never knew that I liked science until I got to college. I grew up thinking I was an English kid and a literature person. And I think it's tempting when kids in high school, teenagers are younger, to self-stereotype in a way instead of being more open to new experiences and new avenues. And I was kind of taken aback when I got to college. I had to take some required science courses, and I found myself loving biology, being totally fascinated by the advances in biology that were leading to breakthroughs in medicine. And it was very personal for me because I had a friend in high school pass away of leukemia. So medical breakthroughs for me at that age were like really front and center in my mind. So I think it was a confluence of personal events and intellectual fascination that led me towards science and the life sciences in particular. And then it all really coalesced back in 2006. I was doing a reporting internship for the Orange County Register in Washington, D.C. And one of my assignments in the DC bureau was to cover President Bush's first veto of his presidency, which, if you remember, was to deny funding for stem cell research.
Yep.
And I had a feeling of moral outrage at that because it was suppressing such a promising avenue of research on these, what I thought was totally phony moral ground. So I realized, it's not just science that excites me, but it's also the intersection with society and politics and ethics that was really, it really got me interested and motivated to learn more. So that's kind of how I fell into this niche of what I now know as bioethics.
And you integrated those into novels consciously, purposefully?
The first novel that I wrote directly arose from that experience in DC, and that's around stem cell research. And then I realized that there's so many topics within this bioethics world that are really rich for exploration in fiction because they're life and death stakes and they're very timely, and a lot of them are unexplored and don't have black and white answers yet. So I just kept thinking with each book, like, what's a different issue area that would be really interesting for fiction.
Good. And so where can people find your books before we go on to other topics?
They should be available anywhere, but probably everyone just goes to Amazon and they're there, Kindle and everything else, audio.
Good. So you say you loved the program at NYU in journalism. Most of people's perception of journalism today and the perception of how it's taught is that journalists are not taught to care about facts and reality and being objective, but it's more about, there is no such thing as objective reality. It's was that your experience, or was your experience different than that?
My experience was very different from that. I was in journalism school from 2003 to 2007. And at that time, the internet hadn't taken hold so much. There was no social media really that was impacting society yet. And we really still read paper newspapers for the most part and magazines. And I think that has a lot to do with the reason why my program was, in a sense, more pure or undiluted by today's politicization and misinformation that's just rampant, because it was more of a traditional news business at that time, with that emphasis on objective reporting. In-person fact gathering was a really big deal. So for a lot of my assignments, I would have to go out in the real world and observe, and we had to use all of our senses to describe what was going on and talk to sources from all different aspects of the story. And that was the training we got. It wasn't today where the experience of being a reporter is you're just going online and you're making phone calls. So it's very different now.
So you think that the state of journalism has changed dramatically over the last 20 years?
I would say so, yes.
For the worst, obviously.
Yeah.
Cook asks, do you think, the state of journalism, you read my mind, is better or worse than it was pre-internet? Do you think it's much worse today than it was before the internet? Because journalists are not focused on the facts, not focused on actually going out there and gathering facts for themselves?
I think there's a little bit more nuance to that question. I wouldn't say it's on the whole worse. In some ways, it's actually a lot easier to do journalism and to do it well because you have so much information at your disposal. You can reach any source and find anybody's contact in an instant. You can do FOIA requests and learn things that are unsealed from the federal government in much quicker time periods, for example, than in the old paper days. So there's a certain efficiency now that I think is really worth emphasizing. But at the same time, journalists themselves are people too, and are not, infallible in the sense of having a strong political viewpoint and an agenda in a story. And I think that's what is really corrupting influence on the trade, not as much the internet. And we could talk about reasons for that, but I think social media and politicization of our society has contributed to that general, experience of most people feeling very split in some way, and that's going to be represented in their work.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely worth exploring. So, I mean, there seems to always have been a bias kind of in place like the New York Times and so on. I mean, Rand talked about it. And have you seen this movie, Mr. Jones?
I have not.
You should see it. You should watch it. I think you'd really like it. And it's about a journalist in the 30s in the Soviet Union, goes to the Soviet Union, and even there, the New York Times is covering up kind of the Stalin regime. There's always been a bias, and I think everybody's known it, but there's a sense that something has shifted over the last, I don't know, I don't think it's just the Trump presidency, because I think it goes back further. I think it goes at least the Obama, where the bias is naked, and they're not ashamed of it, they're not embarrassed by it, they're not trying to hide it. It just is. And so, do you see that? And do you if it's not what's being taught in journalism school, where do you think that's coming from?
The overt bias. I think a lot of it goes back to the nature of the news business. So that's one reason why the internet has been destructive, right? The internet has made all information free, in the sense that everyone feels entitled to free information and they don't want to pay for news subscriptions. So that means that news organizations have to have very clickbaity and often sensationalized stories to get people to click and keep reading their outlet. So there's a clear tendency to, if your business is like on the verge of dying and you're losing monetization left and right, you have to stay afloat somehow. And so these different organizations lean into their audience. So for the Times, it's the left wing, and they give their audience what they want to hear so that they keep getting clicks. So it's a kind of a cycle that's not really incentivized for pure objective reporting anymore because of the business itself.
Duncan Curry says he's a big fan. Let's see. What's your take on traditional newspaper like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times? Do you think they've gotten corrupted as well in the last years? I think you just answered that. So you think they have, obviously, and they've kind of found a niche of who their financial supporters are, and that's how they make their money.
They overtly do cater to their crowds, and all of them do. It's not just the Times and the Post, right? Like Fox News is clearly right wing, and some of them are so overt that it's kind of embarrassing to even like look at them anymore.
Yep. Do you see a shift from people becoming journalists out of a need to seek the truth and tell a story versus a desire to change the culture, or as a tool to promote an activist kind of point of view?
That's an interesting question. I think the activism that we're seeing today is much more prevalent than it was when I was coming up as a young journalist. And I can only imagine that is giving people a certain feeling of mission when they go to write news, which probably isn't compatible as much with the objectiveness that you want, the objectivity that you want.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when did you start doing science journalism?
So science journalism goes for me way back to, I guess, the early stories on stem cells in 2006. And then I took a little bit of a break with my career. I went into book publishing. It was kind of like a left turn. I thought I would find more satisfaction as a book editor than a journalist, and quickly realized in publishing that unless I want to spend my day in meetings all day, every day, and reading crappy manuscripts on the weekend, I just didn't really want to be in book publishing. So I switched back to journalism, which for me is like way more exciting and interesting and fast moving. And I've been doing that since about 2000, I want to say 2012.
So tell us a little bit about Leaps Magazine, Leaps Mag.
So Leaps Mag, it's my baby. It's a digital magazine online that I founded and have been running ever since 2017. So I was recruited to run it by a venture capital division of the pharma company Bayer, but they were looking for somebody to autonomously run this news magazine, not as anybody influenced by them, but just to bring to light stories and issues across the life sciences around innovation and around ethics and innovation that they wanted to be very credible and resourced by journalists and not by them, because they felt that was a responsible way to move forward as part of their portfolio of investing in breakthrough technology. They said we shouldn't just foist this on the public. We should also have like a neutral outlet to discuss what it all means and what it is. So that's how I got pulled in as a journalist. They recruited me. And I said, look, I'm not doing a PR thing for Bayer. That's not my thing at all. And they're like, no, you're going to be completely on your own. Like you can just set it up and run it. And then that's what's happened ever since.
And they've left you alone. So they've let you do what you want.
Completely. I'm completely independent. They don't see anything I publish. I publish things critical. I can tell you, I have a perfect example actually. Right. So a couple weeks ago, not to antagonize people who may be listening, but I published a story on hydroxychloroquine.
Yep.
And it was critical of the use of this drug outside of a clinical trial because of what the author said was a lack of robust evidence from randomized controlled trials to use this as a new standard of care, right? Outside of an experimental setting. So that happens to be a Bayer drug. And I published a story basically saying, don't use this. And they, you know what they said to me afterwards? They were like, we're really happy you did that. It's a really important story and our company should have taken a stand, and the company hasn't said anything, but they're like, you did the right thing.
Oh, good.
So.
Good. Was that the article by Amesha Dalcha?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. That was a good article. Good. Let me just remind the questioners, because I'm getting questions from all over the place. Questions on topic, not off topic, so on topic. So you started Leaps Mag. What kind of stories are you looking for? How often do you publish? Who are the writers? Who do you get to write for the publication?
Sure. So all of our stories are written by freelance journalists or academics or intellectuals that I hire. So I do basically two types of stories. One is a reported feature, standard journalistic article where we gather the facts, we talk to multiple sources, we present a story on a given topic, and often it's around the intersection of a new innovation and its implementation in society or its ethical implications, or it might just be how a new innovation is coming to light and what the promising new science is that's underway. So I basically have three goals. One is to dispel misinformation about the life sciences, which is way too common today. One is to ponder and reflect on how we should deal with new breakthroughs that we've never dealt with before. And one is to inspire optimism for the ways that science can improve our life and to really help instill a respect and appreciation for science that is truly missing from our society. And so all the people are independently hired by me on a per article basis.
Okay. And so it's mostly scientists. You're not really dealing with journalists as much?
No, I would say it's mostly journalists. Okay. It's mostly like veteran freelance writers and reporters. And then here and there, I'll hire a scientist or a researcher to do like a point of view essay.
And do you find journalists in science writers, better generally in terms of their objectivity than kind of journalism out there that we're critical of?
I think science journalism in general is better than the regular journalism, which often has so much to do with politics. But now we're seeing politics and science converge so much. It's almost hard to separate them anymore. The trouble with some science journalism is that it's very hard to tell a compelling story when you're talking about science and lab work and really abstract concepts that are hard to understand if you're not trained. Yep. So I think that's something Leaps Mag is really good at, and that's something we've built up as a capacity, is making science and stories about science more engaging and accessible to a big audience.
So there's always been an aspect of science that's been political. I mean, you mentioned stem cells, which is the obvious one under the Bush administration. And they also did a horrible study about life extension where they came out, Leon Cass, I think, was the author of that one, against life extension. I hate Leon Cass. He's one of my all-time.
He was the inspiration for the villain in my first book.
Oh, good. I hate that guy. And he's still around and he still writes and he's still as evil as he was back then. And then, of course, climate change was politicized. But it feels right now that everything is politicized, that everything around us is, particularly in science, particularly in COVID, but it's beyond COVID. It's like everything that people talk about feels like it has some political angle. What do you think brought that about? Why is it much worse now than it was 20 years ago?
That's a really hard question to answer. I don't know if I have any particular expertise on how to answer that, but just as like a personal reflection on the question, I think probably the fact that our leadership has been so abhorrent in recent years that we've failed as a country in many ways and disrespected people's rights in so many ways that I think everything now comes down to either you're with us or you're against us, because we can no longer afford to ignore politics as much as I wish we could.
Yeah, it's become so tribal, unthinking. Yeah. And of course, yes, you get these pressure groups and everybody's fighting over this pie that the government's divvying up, and it becomes us versus them about everything, including science. So let's talk about COVID and what's going on right now. So let's start with what's your thoughts on how the media has covered this from the beginning, and whether you think they've done a good job or bad job, and in what respects?
I mean, the media is so broad, it's hard in a way to comment on just like that one thing, because it's so disparate and there's so many voices and platforms amplifying different types of stories. But I think some of the media was way ahead of the COVID crisis. The science outlets in particular that I follow every day were way ahead of all of this. I mean, in a way, I wish that the science writers and editors were the ones advising the government, because they had it on their radar like January 1 that this was happening. Whereas maybe the rest of the media, like the normal media, wasn't as in on it. But for people in science media, this was like not a surprise at all. By the time this all happened, like in March, we'd all been reporting. I had stories on coronavirus in January too. So
I had actually interviewed Amesh at the end of February on this. No, at the beginning of February on this. Yeah. People were already talking about what was going on in China, and it was a story.
Yeah, it was a story that was far away. And I think the fact that we didn't, quote, see it coming and let it go on and on like undetected for so long is a true travesty of our leadership. But as far as the media did some real damage earlier on, because a lot of the earlier stories were about how this is just the flu and like everybody's panicking and don't panic and all that, which, looking back on it, I'm sure they were well intentioned, but it really was very different, still is very different, and is really disingenuous to make it sound like the same thing. And so that was really bad and turned a lot of people off. And the right-wing media especially is guilty of that. Like truly downplayed it, taking the line from Trump that it's all going to go away and like all these silly things. It was a hoax. Like there's actually a study done comparing the viewership of Hannity and Tucker Carlson.
Yep.
And Hannity was like one of the worst offenders, basically saying like, this is nothing. Carlson actually took it really seriously and like warned people about their behavior and the way that this was happening really fast. This study looked at where their viewerships were and kind of correlated to what these hosts were saying at the time. Turned out that Hannity's viewership died at a higher rate than Carlson's viewership.
Huh.
Because they ignored the whole thing and didn't take any precautions. So I think in that way, the right-wing media is like really corrupt.
Yeah. And to what extent do you think, though, that the left-wing media, if we can call them that, CNN and the others, were panicking people about it and made this out to be worse than what it actually is?
It's hard for me to say that they were panicking and made it worse, because you're looking back on the time and trying to do Monday morning quarterbacking. At the time, we thought the death rate was 3.5%. So of course the media is going to freak out when those statistics come to light by the WHO and other organizations, and then people are going to say, okay, this is really, really bad. Now we know it's way, way less than that. But at the time, I don't necessarily think that they were like clearly doing anything wrong by making people alarmed about it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, to Amesh's credit, the first time I had him on, he said he thought it was going to land up being about 0.6. And
Yeah.
it's amazing because it's probably about 0.6 now.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think the epidemiologists, this is the thing about all this, they understand this stuff. They know this stuff, and they had it pretty much right from the beginning. It's just that nobody seemed to listen to them. And there was this hysteria on the one hand, and it's nonsense on the other hand. And then everybody got into those tribes, and you couldn't budge them. You couldn't budge them from that. So what's your sense of the response to it? The response politically, the response of individuals, of institutions?
Appalling.
Yeah.
Word. I think that this failure of our administration right now to tackle COVID will go down in history as one of the most epic failures of any country's leadership in history.
Yep.
That's how bad it has been.
I agree. I said to somebody the other day that I'm so glad we don't, I mean, this is bad, but I'm so glad we don't have to fight like a World War II right now, because if the competence exhibited here, we would have lost that war. There was it's incompetent at every level. Every
single level, yes. Yeah. We were so fundamentally unprepared, and you can't only blame, Trump and the top. It's every level of government was unprepared. The FDA and the CDC deserve a lot of blame, totally negligent and uncoordinated, all of it. It's just a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, and it would be one thing if we said, okay, they blew it in the beginning because they didn't get it, but we're still sitting today and we're not testing enough. We're not screening. We're not isolating. We're not doing the basics that every epidemiologist would tell you needs to get done in a pandemic.
This is one of the things that gets me really angry is the testing debacle. So they clearly screwed up the testing from, before day one. Everybody knows that story already. But even now, I think this is really important for your listeners to understand. One of the biggest things we could do to literally end the pandemic in the sense of being able to go back to normal, not end the virus existence, but go down to a more tolerable level, is to test everybody as often as possible. Yep. And for that, we cannot use the PCR test, which is the one that everybody uses now, which you have to grow the virus up in a lab and use all these special reagents, and it takes a long time. That is such a sensitive test that it's not useful anymore. It can detect the virus after you're not even contagious. So what we need now is a contagiousness test, not a PCR test. Yep. And the technology exists. It's already developed. It's a paper strip like a pregnancy test. And why are we not using that?
And it costs a buck a piece.
Yeah. Why do you think we're not using it?
FDA hasn't approved it.
The FDA hasn't approved it, but not even just hasn't, and they're going to. There's no approval pathway for that, because guess why? It's not as sensitive as the other test. And so to them, it's not up to the quote standards, but the standards are completely unrealistic for being in a pandemic where you just need to know if people most likely are contagious or not. It doesn't have to be to this extreme accuracy standard. So the fact that there's not even a regulatory mechanism to get it approved is what really frustrates me, because I don't even know if we can hope for this to come through.
No, it's stunning, because I remember this technology, actually, it's a home test. You take it, you do it at home. You can do it as many times a week as you want. If you're going to visit an older parent, or you're going to, you can test, and it doesn't tell you if you got COVID or not. It tells you if your viral load is high so that you are contagious or not. And that's what's important.
We want to know. We don't care if you had the virus 2 weeks ago. We want to know right now, can you go to school? Can you go to work? Can you get on the airplane? All of that. That should all be standard in our society everywhere now.
I remember in March, I was still traveling, in the middle of March. And I told people what I want is the ability before I get on a plane to test myself, after I get off the plane to test myself, I want to be able to know, every trip before. Now, of course, I didn't realize I was never going to travel again, but, every trip before and after, exactly what my status is. And the tests have been available for a long time. I remember reading about home tests 2 months ago, and the FDA still has refused to approve these. And as you said, there's no process here.
Only reason that we're not using them on a mass scale is because of a lack of political will, because the Trump administration says we do lots of testing, we don't need this.
Yeah, which is insane.
This is what's really bizarre, is that it would be a massive government investment to really scale this up and produce it at a level that really only the government, I think, can fund during a pandemic. Like, you can't expect a company to produce, billions of dollars worth of these tests. I think it should actually it should require the government investment to do this. But so that's why the companies also aren't scaling up, because they are not sure if it's going to be allowed. So it's just like this stalemate where nothing's happening, but the technology exists.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, in a free market, who knows who would have, I think insurance companies would fund something like this. It would be clearly in their self-interest, but given how government is in our lives to the extent that it is, nobody else can fund it. They've messed up the healthcare system so badly. Yeah. That there's no real alternative to government funding. And the one job government has is to test and to trace and to isolate people who have the virus. That's it. They don't really have much of a function beyond that during a pandemic.
Right.
And they put it up from day one.
They've only put in, I think I read it too, like a couple $100 million into testing, whereas they're actually losing like billion something dollars a day in the economy because everything is crashing around us, but they won't invest into this critical infrastructure that we don't have.
Yes, this $3.7 trillion, not billion. That's 1,000 billion, $3.7 trillion into stimulus and a few $100 million into testing, which is insignificant in the big picture. And one of the objections the Trump administration had to this latest stimulus package, which was awful, but one of the objections was Congress wanted more money for testing, and Trump didn't want that, which is,
it's almost criminal. Yep. How poor this leadership is. It's such an outrage.
So Adam asks if you know about Helen Shu.
Yes.
I think it's a Seattle scientist. Can you tell us the story of Helen Shu?
Yeah, so Helen Shu is a Seattle scientist who works on this influenza surveillance system in Seattle, where Seattle is like a very innovative area of our country in terms of tracking disease. And they have actually like amazing models for being able to catch diseases in real time. So Helen Shu is one of these scientists in that network. And she realized early on that, hey, that first patient from China that came to the US with COVID was in Seattle. And she said, hey, I wonder if this is like causing community spread and we're not testing for it. Mm-hmm. And she asked the FDA for permission to adapt the influenza surveillance network to also test people for COVID, because they were testing people anyway. And the FDA said, no, your network was not set up to test for COVID. You only have approval to test influenza. And this woman, who's an incredible hero, she deserves to be well known, at a certain point, even after she got this rejection, said, to hell with the government. We have to do this testing now. This is real, a serious threat. And she just started testing people, and they found a high school kid with it and some other people. And then she kind of was a whistleblower in a sense on the whole crisis and alerted the country, hey, this is actually spreading in our community undetected, and it's a very real threat. And it was only later that then the CDC said, okay, we have to test, and here's the criteria for who to test and travel history and all that. But they were so far, not only behind the ball, they were preventing the ball from even rolling down the hill.
Yeah, and she risked, funding for a project. She risked a career to do this. She's a real hero. I mean, her name should be known. I
reached out to her for Leaps Mag. I wanted to do a profile of her, and she didn't want to cooperate, but we did a story anyway without her answering our questions.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is she's afraid.
Yeah.
Because of the bureaucracy will come after her when it's all done, unfortunately. So there's a lot of science being done right now related to COVID. There are tons of publications, tons of studies, some of them published in top journals, some of them pre-publication, pre-peer review, and a lot of contradiction. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions coming out. There's a lot of studies that contradict it, studies that have been withdrawn. Like I think it was, I can't remember if it was the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine that would do that big study. And how do you, for a layman, how should we approach these, and how do you even evaluate what's going on? Should we even try?
This is really like one of the big questions we have to face right now. Okay, if we're lay people and we're trying to make sense of this, I think one of the best rules of thumb we can use is to not try to latch onto media hype about any given new study. If it's a preprint in particular, which means it hasn't been peer-reviewed, it's just been uploaded to a server. I think we have to have a lot of skepticism about those studies. The process of science normally takes months to have critical outsiders review and then make the manuscript better and point out flaws. Now we're seeing this happen overnight. Like studies are posted, they could go through peer review in a day and then be published in a journal like the next day. So it's really taken down the credibility of these journals a lot, I think. And you know, the retractions they've had recently were very embarrassing. It is very confusing to the regular person, like what's worth listening to and what's noise. And I actually interviewed a couple of scientists about this very question, and they said that the proliferation of information right now is actually an existential threat to science. And it's not just to lay people, it's to the big companies that are trying to develop treatments and cures. For example, Regeneron. This is a company that's working to develop an antibody treatment for COVID. But earlier in the pandemic, they saw one of these early studies come out that said a certain drug in China was so promising, it was like a magic bullet, and this was amazing. So they put in a lot of their resources, money, and testing to follow up and see if that was a treatment worth developing and commercializing. And it was just, he said it was just a mirage. It was just one of these, unreliable studies that they kind of wasted a lot of their effort on. So it's not just a problem for us, it's a problem for like the people in the field too, that there's just so much noise out there. It's hard to pay attention and know what to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I read something in Leaps Mag where there were two scientists. One of them specializes in kind of finding fraud in science articles. It was fascinating to read, and so she reads the articles that are being published, and she's trained herself now to find all the things that are red flags in terms of the kind of science that's going on. Yeah, I highly recommend reading it and then following this woman, because it sounds like she's a real expert at being able to take these studies apart.
Yeah, she's a particular expert in image duplication. Mm-hmm. So she knows when they publish these pictures of cells and all these different like very abstract things, she'll like be able to kind of hit the nail on the head, like that was fraud, this they made up, and it's amazing what she's able to do. Her name's Elizabeth Bick, and she's amassed a huge Twitter following. I was going to answer another part of your question. So what should lay people do to make sense of this really confusing time? So my strategy is I go straight to the source that I know is credible and trustworthy. And for me, these are scientists that I've identified, or doctors, epidemiologists, who I know don't have a conflict of interest in their own perception of a study. They are often on Twitter, they talk in real time amongst themselves, and that's how I find a lot of my sources and my stories, because I just go straight to that source and kind of ignore like a lot of what not ignore, but like I read the media, but I don't take it like at face value necessarily. I just want to like hear from the people who are really experts in their fields to know whether I should be really paying attention to a new study or not.
And how do you know, of course, that's the challenge there is sometimes to find those experts and to know who those people are. You know, again, for the layman, there's so much contradiction, right?
So I published a story on Leaps Mag a couple months ago called "The Best Coronavirus Experts to Follow on Twitter."
Oh, cool.
These are people I source that I find credible, and they're out there if you want to go look that up. I think it's a really helpful resource.
Good, good. So, of the treatments out there that are being researched, and I know there are a lot of them. You know, I think there are 299 vaccines, and I don't know how many treatments are being studied all over the world. It's a pretty international kind of thing. What do you find? What are you seeing that seems to be most promising?
I really have been hopeful for the monoclonal antibodies. So these are lab-grown antibodies that they kind of got originally from recovered COVID patients. They chose the best ones because not all antibodies are created equal, the most potent ones, and then they grow them up in the lab and engineer them. They're called monoclonal because they're from one cell, like one antibody, and then they clone them like a whole bunch of times to make a lot of them. Yeah. And they can theoretically be used as both preventive in case you get exposed, you take this, and as treatment early on in the disease. I don't know how late they would be effective or not, but we don't really have anything as a treatment, as a preventive or as an early treatment right now. The treatments that they're using are for later stages of the disease, the steroid and remdesivir. So what we really need is treatment early and preventive. And so that's why I'm hopeful for that. Although I just saw today that there's two main companies doing it, Eli Lilly and Regeneron. And they're both having some trouble recruiting for their studies. It's an infusion drug, and the patients have to be able to like sit with an IV for a while. So they're trying to figure out how to bring those patients into what locations that are secure so they don't like spread the disease around. So the clinical trials are like more complicated than they realized right now. And initially they had said we'd have this data by the end of the summer, potentially approval in the fall. Now they're saying we should have the data by the end of the year, which is pretty disappointing. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of these, I mean, I guess vaccine, they expect to take years, really. But it seems a lot of the treatments, the trials are difficult. I mean, it's not easy to set up proper trials. I don't think people fully appreciate that.
Yeah, the logistics are really challenging with such a contagious disease that, and then another part of that, going back to the testing, is you have to enroll people who just got sick for the prophylaxis, for the early treatment side, right? So you have to start the treatment within 3 days. But if your test takes 7 days to come back, now you can't even enroll that person anymore. So like that is a huge, huge roadblock in getting these trials to happen.
Yeah, the idea that tests are taking 7 days is so messed up. I mean, you can't trace. Tracing is useless if it takes 7 days, right? It's a waste of time. And, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Singaporeans all got this pat. Their test came down fast. They did the tracing. They shut this whole thing down. And we in the United States of America taking I had a test done, and every time my wife had hers, and hers came back in 7 days. Mine took 9. Right? And what's the point?
Useless, because you could get infected in that period, and now you're contagious, but you think you're fine 9 days later.
Yep. Yeah. It really is absurd. How bad that part of it is. So any other treatments that are interesting or research that's being done that's interesting?
I'm highly focused on the vaccine, as I think everybody is. Mm-hmm. So
what is your sense of how that's going?
The trials are going well so far. It's pretty unprecedented how quickly they've been able to get from first dosing in March in humans to right now, several of the candidates are in 30,000 people of phase 3 testing. So far the safety and efficacy, well, we don't know efficacy, right? The safety data so far has been good on what's been released from various different candidates. Mm-hmm. Of course, those are small phase 1 trials, and I'm really eager to see what happens with these phase 3. There's 30 to 50,000 people in each trial that they're currently dosing, and hopefully we will, at the earliest, have data on that around, the latest I'm hearing is like end of October, at the very earliest, most likely November, December.
And what's your sense of, given how pathetic we've been so far, what's your sense of the ability then to ramp up production and deliver and make choices about who gets vaccinated and who doesn't? And then, of course, there's other people who don't want to get vaccinated, but that's
a whole other thing.
Yeah.
I think there's inevitably going to be some serious logistical problems getting this out. It's never been attempted before, getting the entire population vaccinated with a new vaccine in record time. It's just like a feat that is unimaginably difficult. So there's for sure going to be big problems getting it out. I know they're already scaling up manufacturing now. They, in multiple places, the manufacturing is already underway. The freezer is going to be a big challenge because some of these vaccines need to be frozen at minus 70 degrees centigrade, I believe.
Okay.
So, that's not something that most doctors' offices have in their office. So the cold storage supply chain is something that the experts on this are really, really working on. I don't know what the solutions will be, but that's going to be a problem. And the priority access. So there's this committee, I don't know if you're aware of, it's called ACIP.
No.
It's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices in the US. And they advise the federal government and the CDC on who should get access in what order. So they are meeting monthly right now to figure that out. And I just attended a session with the head of that committee. They have a public session. They're going to be transparently debating this. I think the session is on August 26th.
Okay.
If anybody wants to follow along with that debate. But what he said so far is that, there's not going to be big surprises. It's going to be frontline healthcare workers, essential workers, and old people and people with comorbidities that get it first.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. It still strikes me as insane that right at the beginning, when it was obvious the relationship between mortality and age, that the whole focus and energy of the political world wasn't on isolating old people and isolating people with comorbidities. That should have been everything. And instead in New York, they were sending patients from the hospital back to nursing homes. And they did the same thing in the UK. Exactly the same thing happened in the UK. And surprise, surprise, both those countries, we have very high rates of deaths in nursing homes. But it's stunning to me that wasn't the focus from day one, because we had the demographic data from China, and it turns out that it hasn't changed much.
Yeah. But now the cases are much more being driven by the young and much less by the old.
But the cases, but that's why death rates are not as high, right, as they were in March, because the young are not dying anywhere close. What is, with regard to the young, what is your view of schools reopening?
My personal view is it's dependent on the location, and if there's a high level of community spread, I would not send my kid back to school. I'm not. I am in that, real life scenario. I have a 3-year-old, and I would love more than anything to send him back to school. But where I live in Orange County has so much community spread. And what's worse is I feel like we're flying blind because we're not doing enough testing. So yeah. I'm not going to risk that and then go visit with my parents and bring it home to them. And so right now we're not even doing school. But if you live somewhere, maybe like New York City, where the spread is less than 1%, it's reasonable to go back and see how it goes if you're constantly testing.
And this is part of this politicization of the whole thing, is everything has a one-size-fit-all solution, instead of the counties where the spread is very low, they should open up schools. The counties where, and why not make these decisions on a case-by-case basis, on a school-by-school basis, on a parent-by-parent basis? Give parents the options, give teachers the options. But no, it has to be a political issue. Republicans think this, Democrats think that, and that's what we should do.
Well, and then to threaten funding if they don't open up in areas where there's massive spread seems, unconscionable. I don't understand that.
Well, it's part of the problem of having government schools and having a bureaucracy that manages them, rather than private schools that would make decisions based on their judgment and based on the judgment of the parents.
Yeah.
Christopher asks, has this virus been proven to be naturally occurring and ruled out as man-made?
You know, there's conspiracy theories obviously out there about the lab-made escaped virus, and I haven't heard any proof that it's lab-made. I've read stories saying like there's a lot of circumstantial, suspicious nature about how it came about and where, but I would hesitate to speculate. I don't know. I haven't seen anything other than that it's a natural virus. I haven't seen any smoking gun that's like, oh, this is clearly a lab-grown escaped virus.
From what I've read, people have looked at the DNA, say it doesn't look man-made because they're usually signs, things that they would do. And the other thing is, it might have come from a lab, but it was a natural. It was probably a lab where they were studying bad viruses, and maybe somebody in the lab caught it and then transmitted it. But that doesn't mean it's made in the lab. It just means that it was being studied and came from there. They still don't know where it came from exactly.
Whether it was like some nefarious plot to cause a pandemic seems really unlikely.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. Of the many vaccines out there, so I don't know if you know the answer to this. Why are there so many vaccines being? Why are so many people? I mean, I think it's 199 different vaccines are being tried right now. Is that because people think there's a profit opportunity? Is that because there are so many different avenues of research that justify so many?
There are multiple technological approaches to developing the vaccine. Some are based on like the older approaches of weakened or inactivated viruses. Some are using new genetic technologies, just delivering like the mRNA code or the DNA code of the antigen. So, you know, I think it's a good thing. I don't know why. I think why is just the public health urgency of it, that everyone who has a capability, who has worked on vaccines in the past, probably feels a major responsibility to invest in this effort. I don't think it's profit driven. I know some of the companies like J&J have said they're not going to profit. They're just going to make it and distribute it. So yeah, I think it's probably just the urgency of the situation and the many, many available technological approaches that are being deployed, and hopefully lots of them will succeed.
I mean, there's a lot of new science since in the last few years around vaccine development that people are doing for the first time. It's why it's going so fast, right? Because typically vaccines take years and years and years.
Many years. I think the fastest vaccine ever developed took 4 years.
Yep.
But that was before the platform technologies that we have today.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, the pandemic came at a good time for technology, because like some companies that are getting a lot of attention, like Moderna, have already been testing this type of new mRNA vaccine for other diseases. And they've already done some clinical trial work, and they've already done some manufacturing. So by the time this happened, it was like 2 seconds for them to take the viral code of this coronavirus and plug it into their platform. And now they just that's why they got to test so quickly, because they already had the infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies were working on Ebola vaccines, AIDS vaccine. We still don't have an AIDS vaccine, and it's been 30-something years that people have been working on it. But a lot of companies had platforms ready to kind of go when this came about. Let's see, we've got Bree writes, my daughters were in phase 3 trials of meningitis B vaccine. It took 9 months of monthly testing, 2 years of quarterly testing. The testing was to make sure they still had antibodies. I mean, here they're probably not going to worry too much about how long you have antibodies yet. Hopefully they start vaccinating well before they know how long it lasts.
Yeah, I think they're going to approve it if they see efficacy data that shows it's at least 50% better than a placebo at preventing or reducing the burden of the disease. Yeah. How long it lasts, nobody knows yet.
And whether the FDA gets its acts together on this, we'll see, because it's screwed up everything else. So
you might be interested actually to hear this. Earlier this week, I attended a private webinar with Peter Marks, who is the person at the FDA who's going to decide about vaccine approval. He's probably the most important person in the US right now.
Yeah.
And the major question that everybody had was, are you going to bow to political pressure to this idea of an October surprise? Because Trump is staking his presidency or re-election on getting this vaccine out, and nobody will want to take this vaccine if it seems like it's being rushed. Mm-hmm. And he was really, really firm, and he said, we are only going to look at the data. He could say this to the end of time. We'll see what actually happens.
What's your sense of this Russian vaccine?
Nothing. I mean, it's still, this is what I'm hearing a scientist I follow talk about it like this. It's not a vaccine. It's a phase 1 vaccine candidate. You can call it a vaccine, but we don't know if it works as a vaccine or not because they haven't done the testing.
So they haven't even done phase 1 or 2?
They've done phase 1, I think, but they haven't done the larger testing that would show you if it works or not.
Corey writes, I think Corey's writing from Australia. Tried to get tested this past week after being sick, but lost my symptoms when I was able to finally get a test. So they did not test me due to the fact that it didn't have the symptoms. He says, quote, because, quote, the government is very strict about these tests. They only test people's symptoms. I even offered to pay for the test, but still nothing.
That's terrible. They should be testing everybody that needs a test or wants a test. They should be testing asymptomatic people because those people are highly contagious. They shouldn't just test people with symptoms. That's horrible.
Yeah, I can't get a test here in Puerto Rico. We could a week and a half ago, but there's a shortage of tests, and now they only testing people with symptoms.
So here's a tip for your viewers. You might not know about this. There are a number of companies that have been approved by the FDA to deliver home collection kits. So they send you a box with a spit tube or a nasal swab, which has shown in studies to be just as accurate as if a nurse does it. You can do it yourself. Mm-hmm. You send it back to their lab and they give you results, they say, in 3 to 5 days. I think it's even less. I think it's 3 days. One of these kits is called Everly Well. If anybody in the US needs a test right now and their county lab is backed up, just order one from this company. It's, if you can, afford it, it's not cheap. It's like $120. But I'll tell you an inside tip. I have one of these kits here at home. I bought it just in case any of us have symptoms. I'm going to use it that day and send it off because I don't want to wait for this BS county to do it.
No, that makes sense. Now I understand that in Orange County, somebody's doing antigen tests that take 15 minutes or something, and they give you results immediately.
Yeah, I've had it done 3 times.
Okay. Are they accurate? Because I've heard mixed reports about it.
There are a lot of really bad ones out there. The doctor that I've seen said that they combed the market and they went with the one with the best rate of accuracy, but it's not perfect by any means. So I had it done several times. I actually really thought I had COVID in February, and that's why I keep getting the antibody testing and it keeps coming back negative. So I'm like,
so you didn't have it.
I guess I didn't have it.
Yeah. I don't know what this question means. Maybe you do. What do you think of Cas9, CAS9 and CAS13 re-COVID?
I think it's super promising. So that's a kind of a gene editing tool, which is having multiple applications beyond what people initially kind of thought it would do. It's already in many cases in clinical trials for treating diseases. It could be used potentially early on in embryonic development to repair genetic mutations. It's a super highly powerful new technology. And it also has an application in COVID testing. It can be used similar to a pregnancy test strip to recognize the RNA of the coronavirus and then give you a result in real time. So that's all in development. There's 2 companies that are working on it. Sherlock Biosciences is one, which is out of the Broad Institute. And then one is Mammoth Biosciences, which is a company in Silicon Valley that's the developer, the inventor of CRISPR. Her name's Jennifer Doudna. It's her company. And they're both working on these COVID testing with CRISPR.
And CRISPR sounds like such amazing technology.
Really, it's really groundbreaking stuff. Yeah.
All right, here's your opportunity. Somebody's asking, why do you care so much? Isn't this just the flu?
Really? I mean,
It's still out there, right? It's still out there because people, it's on my YouTube channel, right? So people still believe it's just the flu.
so I guess I would just answer it like this. On average, the death rate is at least 5 times greater than the flu.
Yep.
If you're older, the death rate is astronomically higher. The death rate for people in their 70s and 80s is like 20% if they get infected. This is nowhere like the flu. And the flu is not an honest comparison because we have an antiviral. We have flu vaccines. They're not perfect, but they reduce a lot of the burden of flu. Right now, we have nothing. So when you have nothing and you have a way more fatal illness, that's a really serious threat.
Yeah. I don't understand people can't do the math, right? They say 0.6%, that's like the flu. No, that's 6 times the flu. The flu is 0.1. And as you said, I mean, the numbers I see, if you're over 80, it's 25%.
Yeah.
You have a parent over 80. I have parents over 80. I mean, I'm terrified. They get it. It's a death sentence, particularly if they have comorbidities.
Here's another thing I think gets really left out of the flu comparison. So flu, we know is a respiratory illness. For most people, you get sick, you feel crappy for a couple of weeks, and then you're fine. You go on with your life. With COVID, it's really distressing that it's actually not a respiratory illness. It's a vascular disease, right? It's a blood vessel disease to the latest of our understanding. So many people with mild cases have cardiac abnormalities, neurological problems. There's blood clots. There's all kinds of things that are like insane that don't happen with a regular respiratory flu virus. And these people, these long haul COVID people, many of them are sick for months. So it's also unfair to just talk about the death rate and ignore survivors who are dealing with long-term consequences.
So here's another political one. What about masks? Can you believe that masks are political?
It's really depressing. So look, it's really simple. Wear the mask. You're outside and you're near a lot of people, wear the mask. You're inside, wear the mask, okay? It lessens the likelihood that you will get an infectious dose if you're the wearer of the mask, if you're wearing a good quality mask, right? These homemade, the neck gaiters and single cloth masks are crap and useless. Don't wear those. Use 3-layer masks. Cotton and chiffon is the best combination. If you can get like a KN95 mask or a surgical mask. Any of these masks are reasonably effective at lessening the amount of both your exhaled virus and also helping to protect you. Yeah.
It's stunning to me. I have serious people telling me, but the virus is smaller than the holes in the mask or whatever. But viruses never travel by themselves. They're coated with fat and they're in a water droplet, which is much larger than the gaps within the mask. And it reduces the load. Why is this so hard?
There's a certain kind of motion that occurs at that level of particle that's not intuitive to us. So like there's an electromagnetic component where it'll stick to a mask and the fabric of it because of the charged particles. It's not only the size that matters. So having a cloth barrier or a surgical mask barrier actually does help.
Somebody says it's Brownian motion.
Yes,
right.
exactly. Thank you.
Yep. So, I've never been so, I have to say, I've never been so pessimistic and so depressed about the state of the world as I am right now. And it's not because of the threat that COVID represents, as bad as that is. It's because of the way people responded to it and the way our politicians, but our bureaucracy, politicians at the state level, just everybody has defaulted on their responsibilities here. And it's rare to find voices of reason when talking about this.
I totally agree.
Yeah, it's very pessimistic. Like people on the stream are saying, "No, Yaron, you can't be pessimistic. Don't be pessimistic." They rely on me on lifting them up a little bit, but
I can try to lift them up a little bit. Like as bad as our leadership is, and our government and our politics is just unthinkably bad, I have hope in science. I really do. The only thing that's going to get us over this hump of this crisis is innovation in science, is treatments and vaccines. And that is actually moving at a record pace. And there's never been another time in history where every single lab, academic, government, major company are all working on this right now. And there's never been this level of funding for it either. So is going to happen. We're going to get there with treatments and vaccines. It's not going to be easy to roll them out. It's not going to be fast. But I think that is what's going to get us through it eventually.
There's no question. No question. What do you find the biggest challenge of being a editor of a science publication?
No doubt the anti-science sentiment out there that's so prevalent, or people that are just totally turned off by it or don't want to hear it, or they're suspicious of it, or they think there's like a lot of negative agendas related to science, and all of that is really poisonous. The misinformation spreads like wildfire, and putting out factual information doesn't necessarily get the clickbaity headlines and the rapid fire spread that scary stories do, and that conspiracy theories do. So it's frustrating.
What do you do to try to combat it? Are you changing the way you write the stories? Are you doing different types of stories?
No, not really. No, I mean, I'm still putting out stories that I think are worth sharing, that have valuable information, that are thoroughly reported and fact checked, and try to get a big audience for it. I'm published by a company called Good and Upworthy, and it's an LA-based media company that is taking over Leaps Mag and creating a nonprofit organization out of it.
Okay.
That's going to happen by the end of this year. And this company has a huge following. They have like 13 or 14 million followers online. And they share every single Leaps Mag story on all of their channels and get us bigger and bigger audience. So we're reaching a lot of people now, which is encouraging, but it's not like we're going to counteract like all of the toxic forces out there.
No. Well, thank you for trying.
Yeah.
To combat those. We need the voices of reason out there, and you're right. I mean, I think in a lot of dimensions of life right now, the one bright spot we have is science and technology and engineers and people moving society forward, moving all our lives forward, in spite of our politicians and in spite of what's going on in the world. So thanks, Kira. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for doing all this. You guys should all go to, it's just leapsmag.com, right? LEAPSMAG.com, right?
Yeah.
You can find the stories there. You can find Kira there. Are you on Twitter, Facebook?
Yep, I'm on all of the above, just my name.
So follow Kira on Twitter and Facebook. Let's see, what have I forgotten to tell you? Like the show. We've got a lot more people watching than are liking. So before you leave, press the like button. It helps with the algorithms. It boosts the viewership. It gets around the fact that YouTube doesn't like me. So like the show, share it. If you enjoyed the interview with Kira, share the show widely. That's how we increase viewership. It's how we get new subscribers. And don't forget to support. If you like what I'm doing, yaronbrookshow.com/support, or you can do it on Patreon, on Subscribestar, on Locals, on every platform known to man. Thanks, Kira. Hopefully we can get together while I'm in Orange County.
Yeah, let's see a socially distanced hangout.
We can do that. I'm actually, one of my first things that I want to do is go get tested in one of these 15-minute ones. I want to get that out of the way so I can visit, some people that I haven't seen in a long time that I'd like to visit.
Well, good luck finding the test.
I know. I might call you and ask you where you got yours.
Tell me later. That's fine.
Yeah. Thanks, Kira. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you guys tomorrow, same time, 8 p.m., same place. And then I'm off to California on Sunday. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.